In 1971, in South Korea, a civilian airplane took off into the sky, but suddenly it was surrounded by military jets that threatened to open fire if it didn't change its course. This civilian plane was heading toward the border with North Korea, South Korea's sworn enemy. But the captain wasn't going toward North Korea willingly, he was under threat. On board was a young man who had hijacked the plane and was threatening the passengers and the captain with homemade hand grenades. The hijacker gave the captain his demands. The plane had to fly to North Korea. That's why the military jets had scrambled to intercept it before it crossed the border. What pushed this young man to carry out such a hijacking? What would happen with the military jets intervening? And how would this dilemma be solved? Because this story is one of those that sound unbelievable, I want to assure you from the beginning, every event you're about to hear is 100% true. Our story takes place in South Korea. As you probably know, the situation between South Korea and North Korea has always been tense. The two countries, though sharing the same land and the same blood, have been in a state of hostility since their birth. After World War II came the Korean Civil War, lasting from 1950 to 1953. Since then, the animosity between the two Koreas has never stopped. North Korea especially had some of the most cunning methods in managing this conflict. One of their most notorious tools was kidnapping. Over the years, especially in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, hundreds of abductions of South Korean citizens were documented, with the victims taken into North Korea. These kidnappings didn't always happen in the air, there were many other ways. The purpose of these operations was often to bring skilled people into North Korea, people with special knowledge or abilities in certain fields. They would abduct them so they could work for North Korea and serve the regime's propaganda. For example, in a previous story I told you, we saw how the North Korean leader kidnapped a South Korean actress and a director, forcing them to make films for him. We also discussed kidnappings in the Japanese airplane incident, which was also tied to North Korea. In this video, we're not just going to see one case, but two related cases, the hijacking of a South Korean plane to North Korea and the abduction of a South Korean pilot. Let's start with the first case, which happened in 1969. That hijacking completely changed the way South Korea handled aviation security. Before this incident, airport security procedures in South Korea were very weak. This was actually the case in most of the world at the time. There weren't strict security checks like the ones we have today. Planes were treated almost like public buses. Luggage and passengers weren't thoroughly checked, so it was easy for anyone to carry a weapon onto a plane without being detected. That's exactly what happened on December 11, 1969. On that day, a Korean Air aircraft was scheduled to fly from the city of Gangneung to the capital, Seoul, a domestic flight inside South Korea. The plane was a Japanese-made YS-11 model. Keep the number 11 in mind, because it will play an important role in this flight. The plane took off from the airport with 51 people on board, 4 of them crew members, the captain, the co-pilot, and 2 flight attendants. After the plane had taken off and was in the air, one of the passengers stood up, pulled out a pistol, and declared that the plane was under hijacking. He immediately entered the cockpit, pointed his pistol at the captain and co-pilot, and ordered them to fly to North Korea. The hijacker threatened the captain and told him that if he tried to contact air traffic control and report the situation, he would not hesitate to shoot him. The captain gave in immediately. He had no choice but to follow the hijacker's orders. It was clear the hijacker was very nervous, and any wrong move could make him lose control. So, the captain steered the plane toward North Korea without informing or contacting anyone. Of course, both the land and air borders between South Korea and North Korea were heavily monitored by both sides. This was, and still is, one of the most militarized borders in the world. Surveillance equipment and Air Force radars detected the civilian plane moving straight toward North Korea at a steady speed. They tried to contact the captain and understand what was happening, but there was no response. That's when the South Korean Air Force immediately scrambled 2 fighter jets to intercept the civilian aircraft and force it to return before it crossed the border. The fighter jets quickly reached the civilian plane and began circling around it. The fighter pilots assessed the situation and noticed the passengers inside showing signs of fear and panic, as if they were begging for help. One of the fighter pilots flew closer to take a look at the cockpit. He tried to communicate directly with the captain, telling him, "Turn the plane around immediately, you are heading toward North Korea." But the captain didn't respond over the radio, he only gave a worried look and shook his head, as if to say, "I can't." At that moment, the fighter pilot noticed someone standing behind the captain, holding a pistol. The pilot realized the plane was very likely under hijacking. The Air Force Command Center initially assumed the captain was defecting to North Korea, so they ordered the fighter to fire warning shots at the civilian plane. But the fighter pilot replied that he had seen a man with a pistol in the cockpit, and it was more likely the plane was hijacked. Command quickly changed their orders. Instead of firing warning shots, they told him, "Shoot one of the engines." The fighter pilot was shocked by the order. He replied, "This is a civilian plane, how do you expect me to shoot at it?" But the command center insisted, "Follow orders. There's less than a minute left before the plane crosses the border. Shoot one of the engines. The plane can still land safely with one engine, but we must make it land on our soil." The fighter pilot hesitated. He was terrified that if he fired at the engine, fuel could ignite and all the passengers on board would die. The command center kept repeating the order, urging him to act immediately. But the fighter pilot froze, he couldn't carry it out. And at that moment, the civilian plane crossed the border and entered North Korean airspace. The fighter jets immediately pulled back, because if they had entered North Korean skies, that would have been considered an act of war. The civilian plane continued its path and landed in North Korea, where officials received it. After the incident, the news spread across South Korea, and everyone heard about the hijacking. The case became the talk of South Korean society for months. North Korea, for its part, announced that the captain and co-pilot had defected willingly from South Korea. They denied that the plane had been hijacked at all. Their official stance was, since the captain and co-pilot never sent a distress call, the plane was not considered hijacked. But inside North Korea, propaganda started spreading rumors that the hijacker had been rewarded with a huge sum. Reports claimed over $2 million for his heroic act. This was most likely a lie, but they knew such stories would leak back into South Korea. The purpose was clear, to encourage more defections or hijackings by making it look like they would be richly rewarded. In the end, negotiations took place between South Korea and North Korea. They reached an agreement to return most of the abducted passengers. And indeed, after 2 months, on February 14, 1970, a handover operation took place. 39 of the hijacked passengers were released and handed back in the demilitarized zone, DMZ, between North and South Korea. Real footage exists of this moment, showing the freed passengers reunited with their families. But the numbers didn't add up. The plane had originally carried 51 people. Only 39 were returned. That means 12 passengers remained in North Korea. North Korea simply kept them. One of them was, of course, the hijacker, whose identity was later revealed. He was an officer in the South Korean army, but for some reason, he wanted to defect to North Korea. Whether he was loyal to the communist regime, had family there, or had been promised some kind of reward, God knows, the true motive was never completely clear. Aside from the hijacker, 11 people were never returned. And here are their photos in front of you. The plane was called YS-11, and it was hijacked. Among those 11 people, there were the crew members, the captain, the co-pilot, and the flight attendants, plus 7 passengers. These passengers weren't ordinary people, they were skilled professionals in different fields, engineers, doctors, company directors. North Korea decided to keep those with valuable skills. These 11 people would end up spending the rest of their lives in North Korea, never seeing their families again. The only exception was one flight attendant named Sammy Yoon-hee, who was able to see her family again in South Korea. But her return wasn't what you might imagine. It wasn't even permanent. Many Korean families had already been separated by the outbreak of the Korean War in the 1950s. It's estimated that more than 1 million people fled from North Korea to South Korea at the start of the war. Those people still had relatives in the north. Even today, deep family ties connect people on both sides of the border. Sometimes, during certain periods, the two Koreas arrange family reunions for separated relatives. These reunions are limited in number, last only 2 or 3 days at most, and usually take place in South Korea. But according to the agreement, everyone who comes from North Korea to reunite must return afterward. So, in 2001, 32 years after the hijacking, the flight attendant, Song Young-hee, took part in one of these reunions. Her mother was an elderly woman in her 80s. These are real video clips of the moment they met. The mother didn't even recognize her daughter at first. After all, she hadn't seen her in 32 years. Her daughter said, Mom, it's me, Young-hee." At first, the mother was confused, not understanding. Then suddenly she realized, hugged her daughter, and burst into tears. But imagine, even after this reunion, the flight attendant had to return to North Korea and continue her life there. By then, she was married and had children. So even if North Korea hadn't forced her to return, her family and life were already there. In fact, she had lived more years in North Korea than she had in South Korea. That was the story of the YS-11 hijacking, a turning point in Korean aviation history. After this incident, the Korean Aviation Authority completely overhauled its security procedures. The first step was much stricter airport screening before boarding. They began using machines and scanners to detect weapons. On board the planes, they installed reinforced cockpit doors, bulletproof doors that prevented anyone from entering the pilot's cabin from the passenger area. The most important measure was the introduction of armed security officers on every flight. Each plane now carried an officer with a pistol, tasked with protecting against hijacking attempts. And from here begins the story of the second hijacking. This flight took place on January 23, 1971, more than a year after the first hijacking. The plane this time was Dutch-made, a Fokker F-27, with a capacity of about 60 passengers. The crew consisted of 4 people: the captain, the co-pilot, 1 flight attendant, and the armed guard. The guard and the flight attendant, of course, stayed in the passenger cabin during the flight, while the guard had to remain alert and carefully watch the area. These are real photos of the crew. The captain's name was Kang Hyun, the co-pilot was Jan Eunice I, the flight attendant was Choi Suk-ja, and the guard's name, I'm honestly not sure if I've got them exactly right, but bear with me. The co-pilot had been a retired military pilot in his 40s, but in civil aviation he was still considered a trainee. Civilian planes, after all, are different from military aircraft. Even though he had been training for a full year in civilian flying, he had never been allowed to land a plane himself, not even once. Landing is considered one of the most critical operations, usually left to the captain. So, a conversation happened between the captain and his co-pilot. The captain told him that he planned to let him land the plane this time, because he believed he was finally ready. The co-pilot was thrilled, happy both with the news itself and with the captain's confidence in him. Passengers boarded the plane, each taking their seats. Within just a few minutes, the cabin was full. But then, one passenger friend was carrying with him a box that looked from the outside completely ordinary. But what no one knew at that moment was that the contents of this box would change the entire course of the flight. The passengers were from all walks of life, young and old, men and women, rich and poor. Some were traveling for business, some to visit family, and others for personal reasons. The flight was set to depart from a coastal city called Socho, with its destination being the capital, Seoul. It was supposed to be a quick, short trip, lasting less than half an hour. Preparations for takeoff began. Most passengers had relatives beside them, some with their mothers, others with their wives, and everyone was chatting without a care in the world. The flight attendant, of course, was busy organizing and helping everyone find their seats. In the cockpit, the captain and his co-pilot were checking the equipment and systems, preparing the plane for departure. Once everything was ready, they asked the passengers to fasten their seatbelts and prepare for takeoff. After the flight attendant confirmed that everyone was seated, the plane began taxiing down the runway. Clearance from the control tower came through, and the captain accelerated down the runway, lifting the nose until the plane rose into the sky. Within minutes, the aircraft was soaring high among the clouds. The passengers admired the beautiful scenery, excited about their journey, each one thinking about their purpose for traveling and hoping the trip would bring good fortune. In the cockpit, after confirming everything was in order, the co-pilot engaged the autopilot. Meanwhile, the onboard security guard made sure the reinforced, bulletproof cockpit door was shut. This door separated the cockpit from the passenger cabin and was meant to remain locked for the entire flight to prevent anyone from breaking in and hijacking the plane. The guard then walked through the aisle, checking on the passengers to ensure everything was normal. At that moment, a young man among the passengers, the same one carrying the box at the start of the trip, stood up. He took the box down, opened it, and pulled out several cans that looked like food tins. The guard was standing in the middle of the aisle with his back to the young man. The man took one of the cans, walked toward the cockpit door, fixed it to the handle, and lit its fuse. The can was, in fact, a bomb. The young man was attempting to hijack the plane. Passengers seated near the front saw the fuse burning and panicked. Before they could shout for the guard, the hijacker grabbed another can, pulled its fuse, this one resembling the pin of a military grenade, and threw it toward the guard. The guard was stunned but quickly realized it was a grenade. He shouted to the passengers, "Grenade! Grenade! Lower your heads!" He ducked behind a seat, bracing for the blast. The guard tried to draw his pistol, but before he could react, the grenade exploded, throwing him to the ground. His head struck hard, knocking him unconscious, and his pistol flew from his hand, landing somewhere between the seats. In the cockpit, the captain and co-pilot immediately felt the shockwave. The co-pilot grabbed the controls to stabilize the plane while the captain instinctively turned his head, trying to see what was happening behind, even though the reinforced door separated them. At that moment, the bomb fixed to the cockpit door detonated. Shrapnel flew, one piece striking the captain just above his eye. The passengers were in chaos. The twin blasts were not catastrophic enough to destroy the plane, but they weren't minor either. The grenade in the aisle tore a hole in the fuselage, causing a loss of cabin pressure. The plane began to lose balance and plunge. The co-pilot gripped the controls with all his strength, fighting to stabilize the aircraft, while the captain writhed in pain from his injury. The plane dropped toward the mountains below, and inside, the passengers clung desperately to anything they could. After regaining partial control, the co-pilot ordered the injured captain to push the altitude lever to full power. The engines roared, and at extremely low altitude, the plane managed to regain stability. With every ounce of strength, the co-pilot pulled back on the controls to lift the nose, narrowly clearing the jagged mountain peaks that were about to smash into them. The plane had survived, for the moment. It flew in the air again. The captain was seriously wounded in the head and was bleeding, and the co-pilot was breathing heavily. What happened? What exploded? The co-pilot said, "I have no idea." He cast a look backward and immediately noticed the hole in the middle of the plane and also noticed that a large number of passengers had lost consciousness. Naturally, with the sudden pressure loss and violent change in altitude, an untrained person will lose consciousness for moments. The captain told the co-pilot to check the oil level and verify the plane's gauges, and while they were busy trying to regain control of the aircraft, a hijacker rose from among the passengers carrying one of his bombs and entered the cockpit. He raised the bomb in the face of the captain and co-pilot and told them, "The plane is hijacked, head to the ocean immediately." Of course, as we said, the flight had been from the city of Socho to the capital Seoul, but now the hijacker wanted them to turn toward the ocean so that afterward they could head up to North Korea, because the easiest way to cross the border is along the coast, and that's what happened in the first hijacking that successfully reached North Korea. He ordered the captain and co-pilot to head for the ocean and told them, "Follow my orders and no one will die," lifting the bomb in their faces and threatening them. The captain's co-pilot began to reason with the hijacker. Okay, we will follow your orders, but first, before we head to the ocean, I must go check the fuselage because the explosion made a hole and the plane's pressure is disturbed. We must fix that or we won't be able to fly normally." The hijacker produced a knife and put it to his throat, saying, "Follow my orders and head to the ocean now." It was clear the hijacker was nervous and irritable, and any dissenting word might make him lose control. The captain intervened to calm the hijacker. Okay, there's no need for violence. We'll cooperate with you. I'll turn the plane toward the ocean and my co-pilot will go check the hole, please. We must fix the pressure first and then I swear we'll go anywhere you want. We'll cooperate fully." The hijacker paused a little, and before he allowed the co-pilot to go inspect the passenger cabin and check the hole, the co-pilot moved toward the hole and tried to cover it with a bag and other items and asked the flight attendant to bring the net they used to secure luggage. The co-pilot took that net, stuffed luggage into it to plug the hole, and tied it tightly. Some passengers were injured and in pain, especially those near the explosion. The rest of the passengers were living in a state of panic and fear. The co-pilot saw the guard lying unconscious in the aisle. He had been most affected because the hijacker had thrown the grenade directly at him. The co-pilot also noticed the guard's pistol was missing from his holster. Some passengers lifted the unconscious guard into a rear seat and sat him there. All this time the hijacker watched them anxiously from the cockpit. Some visibly worried passengers began asking the co-pilot what would happen and whether they would reach their destination. The co-pilot tried to reassure them and calm them, saying things were under control, but his words were not convincing enough and panic began to spread among the passengers, fearing they wouldn't reach their destination. Voices rose and chaos began shouting, complaining, screaming. At that moment the hijacker returned to the passenger cabin and raised the bomb in their faces, shouting at them and threatening in a loud voice, "Stay in your seats and be quiet if you want to keep your lives. This plane will go to North Korea and I don't want to hear anyone or any sound." All the passengers were petrified with terror because they knew what happened when a plane was hijacked to North Korea. Meanwhile, the captain in the cockpit exploited the hijacker's distraction and took the radio, sending a distress call and informing the authorities that the plane had been hijacked and that the hijacker wanted them to head to North Korea. Now the officials knew this plane was hijacked. The co-pilot returned to the cockpit and soon after the hijacker came back there, and they were almost reaching the ocean. The coast was within sight, as you can see on the map. They deviated from their scheduled route and were now almost over the coast, and it was time to turn north. The captain's vision had become poor, as we said. He was struck just above his eye and had lost sight in one eye and the other was impaired, so the co-pilot was doing most of the flying and following the hijacker's orders. He turned the plane north and began flying it along the coastline. The cockpit atmosphere was extremely tense. The co-pilot called for the flight attendant to come and bind the captain's wounds, and the hijacker allowed the flight attendant to enter. The captain asked the hijacker why he wanted to go to North Korea. The hijacker answered, "Why are you afraid of North Korea? There are people living there comfortably. My brother is one of them. My brother is an officer there and lives a comfortable life." The captain asked, "So you did all this to find your brother?" The hijacker produced a paper showing news about the hijacker of the first plane, the YS-11 hijacking we discussed at the start of the video. The paper stated that the defector Hirocho S. Shanji invites you to come north. In short, it was a propaganda leaflet from North Korea that had spread with the news claiming the first hijacker had received a large reward of $2 million. This second hijacker wanted to follow in his footsteps and become a hero in North Korea and also to meet his brother who was there. The hijacker's name was Kim Sentai. He was 22 years old. The photos before you are his real picture. This young man lived in poverty and couldn't find work. His older brother was a soldier in the Korean War in the 1950s and had gone north. According to the information he had, his brother was now an officer with a high rank and enjoyed a comfortable life. After hearing about the first hijacking, that the hijacker was treated as a hero in North Korea and given a big reward, he began planning a second hijacking. It took him time to learn how to make bombs and how to bypass the new security measures. He planned this operation for more than a year until the day of execution. The hijacker was alert, watching every movement inside the plane. When he saw the guard beginning to move as if regaining consciousness, he acted to quickly neutralize the threat. He threw a rope over two passengers and ordered them to get up and go bind the guard with the rope, threatening them with the knife and the bomb in his hand. Under the hijacker's orders, they tied the guard strongly to a seat toward the rear of the airplane. The hijacker stood over them to ensure they did it well. He noticed the guard's pistol was missing, but he wasn't worried because he literally had a bomb in his hand, and if anyone tried to use the pistol on him, he would detonate the bomb at once and the plane would not survive a second explosion. Everyone would die with him. He repeated this phrase many times, saying to the captain, co-pilot, and passengers, "I came here ready to die. I have no problem taking you all with me to hell, so no one should try anything stupid." While the hijacker was focused on tying the guard, the co-pilot decided to act. He broke one of the plane's indicators and then whispered to the captain that they should try to trick the hijacker by pretending they had already arrived in North Korea and telling him they would land. The captain agreed and prepared the announcement. He took the microphone and told the passengers, "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. Our plane was forced to head to North Korea and we will enter its airspace shortly. I also ask you to destroy your identity papers so you will not be recognized." With this announcement, the captain prepared the passengers to believe they were about to enter North Korea, which was not true. They still had distance to go. He instructed passengers to destroy their identity cards, because if they were forced to get off in North Korea, no one could identify their professions and qualifications without IDs, increasing the chance they might be allowed to return. All the passengers began taking out their ID cards and tearing them up. Meanwhile, the co-pilot pressed some buttons to produce an alarm sound. The hijacker immediately noticed the sound and returned to the cockpit, asking, "What is that sound?" The captain lied to the co-pilot, "The fuel is running out." Then the captain said to his co-pilot, "Perform the landing procedure." The hijacker shouted at them, "Do you think I'm stupid? There's no way we could already have reached North Korea that fast." The captain took the co-pilot's hand and pointed to the fuel gauge. "Look at this gauge, it's dropping. The fuel is nearly out. We already passed the border some time ago. We're currently flying over North Korean airspace." The hijacker calmed down a bit as if convinced by the co-pilot's words. The co-pilot began to prepare the plane for landing and started to descend slowly. The hijacker ran to one of the windows and looked out, trying to detect any landmark that would confirm whether they were indeed in North Korea. While the hijacker was occupied, the guard regained full consciousness and tried to tell those around him to release his bonds, but the passengers were all afraid the hijacker might see them. After a few moments, the flight attendant passed by him and used the hijacker's distraction to try to free the guard, but the rope was tied very tightly and she could not loosen it. When she noticed the hijacker might see her, she stopped her attempts and stood up. The plane began to descend gradually in preparation for an emergency landing. As mentioned, the co-pilot had never landed a civilian aircraft before, so imagine this would have been his first landing under these crazy, extreme conditions. He needed the captain's help to land, but the captain's problem was that he could not see. His vision had worsened because of his injury. So the co-pilot was going to have to land on his own. They were flying over an area very close to the North Korean border, and in that area there was a semi-abandoned runway they could use for an emergency landing. The captain and co-pilot knew of it, so instead of landing gradually toward a large airport, they aimed for that small runway. They were at very low altitude, but fate was not on their side. The South Korean flag was visible beside that runway. The hijacker, looking out, saw the flag and quickly realized it was a trick and that they were still in South Korea. He shot an angry look at the co-pilot, returned to the cockpit, and began hysterically shouting at them, "Climb the plane now or I will blow the bombs up on you. Do not land. Do not land. Everyone on board will die. Do you think I'm a fool?" The co-pilot realized the deception had been exposed and immediately said, Okay, I will raise the plane. Don't do anything crazy. He grabbed the controls and began to pull up the plane with all his might. The plane that had been on course to land on the runway had almost reached it, but he was forced once again to obey the hijacker's orders and climb. The aircraft continued north. The hijacker became furious, repeatedly threatening the captain and co-pilot in hysteria, saying if they tried anything stupid again he would not hesitate to take them all to hell. This was his last warning. The co-pilot kept apologizing, saying, "We're sorry, I promise we will comply." His goal was to preserve the lives of the passengers, fearing the hijacker would lose control and detonate the cockpit and cause the plane to fall with no hope of survival. They continued northward and perhaps had about 5 minutes left until the border. The hijacker began to calm down a little, but the calm did not last long. Suddenly a loud sound came from outside. All the passengers panicked when they heard it. It was the sound of fighter jets that had begun to surround their plane. The hijacker quickly ran to see what was happening and saw 2 fighter jets flying beside their plane, one on the right and one on the left. Everyone wanted confirmation that these were South Korean Air Force fighters because the plane was headed toward the border and only minutes remained before reaching the demilitarized zone. The Air Force had to act now. Immediately after the fighter jets surrounded the civilian plane, they began to fire. The shots were not aimed to hit the aircraft directly, these were warning shots, but some bullets did hit the plane's body. This served as a warning that they were not being restrained, and the plane shook violently as the fighters flew past it close by. The hijacker himself banged his head against the side of the plane because he was standing and dizzy. All the passengers were terrified, even the hijacker felt fear. These were real fighter jets firing at them. While the hijacker and the passenger cabin were watching the fighter jets anxiously, the co-pilot seized the opportunity and raised the radio, pleading with the fighters, "We are under hijacking, do not shoot at us, please do not shoot." But one of the fighter pilots replied that they had received a report that they were under hijacking and were about to cross the border and they could not allow them to continue north. They told them to either return the plane or they would shoot one of the engines. This repeated the same scenario as the first hijacking, if you recall. The captain and co-pilot found themselves between 2 fires. Inside, a hijacker threatened them with bombs, and outside, fighter jets threatened to shoot them down. The hijacker returned to the cockpit. The captain turned off the radio and cut communications with the fighter jets. The hijacker was hysterical. The co-pilot cried out in anger, "What's happening? Why are they firing at us? They will kill us all, they don't know there are civilian passengers on board." The co-pilot tried to convince him, "They will not let you cross the border, they will shoot the plane down and sacrifice all the passengers before allowing another hijacked plane to reach the north." The hijacker did not accept his words and insisted, No, impossible, they will not kill the passengers, it doesn't matter to me." He continued north and said, "If they shoot at us, let us all go to hell together." The co-pilot looked at the hijacker's condition and his wound. He seemed weak and dizzy, and the bomb was no longer in his hand. It appeared that after being hit in the head he had tucked it into his coat. The co-pilot knew this was the decisive moment. Only minutes remained until they reached the border, and the Air Force would not allow them to cross. They would fire and bring them down. The only option left was to seize the hijacker and try to render him unconscious or even kill him if necessary. After making his decision, the co-pilot jumped up from his seat and suddenly attacked the hijacker, and they began to struggle. His main goal was to restrain his hands and prevent access to the bombs in his coat pocket. While the hijacker was preoccupied, the flight attendant quickly tried to untie the guard. Meanwhile, one of the passengers had found the guard's pistol that had fallen between the seats. Seeing the fight, he became brave, grabbed the gun, and ran to help the flight attendant free the guard. He used all his strength to cut the rope. The struggle between the hijacker and the co-pilot intensified. The hijacker drew his knife while the co-pilot tried with force to subdue him. The hijacker managed to wound the co-pilot, who fell to the floor. The hijacker raised the knife and at the same time pulled out a bomb from his coat and waved it, screaming hysterically, "Do you want to die? I will kill you. I will kill all these scoundrels with you." He was about to stab the co-pilot when the guard, who had been freed by the passengers, stood up, grabbed his pistol, aimed at the hijacker, and fired several shots from behind, killing him on the spot. At that moment everyone froze in place trying to comprehend what had happened, and before they could catch their breath, the bomb in the hijacker's hand began smoking because he had pulled its fuse at the moment the guard shot him. The bomb's fuse had been pulled, so once the hijacker had his fuse pulled, when the guard noticed the smoking bomb he shouted, "Bomb! Bomb!" The passengers immediately ducked and hid behind their seats, but the catastrophe was that this bomb was literally on the cockpit door. If it exploded, it would destroy the aircraft's control systems and the plane would certainly fall to its doom. In that critical moment, the co-pilot performed an act that can only be called heroic. There were fragments scattered on the floor, remains of the cockpit door that had exploded at the start of the hijacking, and the co-pilot grabbed a piece of that debris, held it, and threw himself onto the bomb to protect the passengers and the cockpit. The bomb exploded directly beneath him. He took the blast. Due to his sacrifice, the explosion was largely contained and the cockpit was not destroyed. Nevertheless, the blast struck the entire plane, and the aircraft lost balance for a moment. The captain was barely able to control it, especially since his vision was nearly gone, but he managed to regain control in the end. The guard quickly rushed to the co-pilot, who was sprawled in blood with severe, critical injuries. Imagine that his left arm and leg were blown off by the force of the explosion. The captain shouted to the guard, "What happened?" The guard replied, "The hijacker is dead, but the co-pilot is critically injured." When the captain heard the hijacker was dead, he immediately turned the plane and headed south. He then took the radio and contacted the control center and the fighter jets around them, informing them that the hijacker had been killed and requesting their help to land. The plane was now severely damaged, especially after the last explosion, and the fuel was nearly exhausted, so they would not reach a normal airport. They had to make an emergency landing somewhere. The control center told them to land on the beach in the nearby Gaziang area. Landing on the beach was the best option because the soft sand would help absorb the impact. The fighter jets assisted in guiding the plane to the beach, but the captain now faced the dilemma of how to perform the emergency landing with his vision almost non-existent. The captain called for his injured co-pilot, saying, "Come, I need you, I cannot land this plane by myself, you must help me." Despite his severe injuries, the co-pilot tried to move to help the captain, but the guard stopped him. "Wait, you are injured. You cannot move, let us try to dress your wounds first." They brought first aid boxes and tried to bandage his injuries as best they could, but his wounds were severe. They administered a painkiller injection to the co-pilot, meant to ease his pain. The passengers then did what they could to assist. Some covered the new hole made by the last bomb, and they used a net to secure luggage over the opening. The plane began to approach the beach, and once again the captain called for the co-pilot to come and take over the landing operation. He wasn't able to do it, and despite the severe injury, the co-pilot, with all his courage and strength, began trying to stand on his feet. The people around him helped him and lifted him onto the seat. Of course, after the painkiller, it helped him significantly because his injuries were extremely severe. The co-pilot sat in his seat, and the flight attendant fastened his seatbelt and said to the captain in a tired voice, "I'm ready to take over the controls." The captain lowered the aircraft's landing gear in preparation for landing. All the passengers sat in their places, fastened their seatbelts, and held on tightly, each one mentally preparing for the worst. The co-pilot looked at the scared passengers behind him and resolved to save them and land the plane safely. The aircraft began descending slowly, with the engines cut off to simulate a glide. The plane approached the beach, and the passengers lowered their heads in anticipation of impact. The co-pilot gripped the controls with all his strength, trying to guide the plane to the shore and make it glide like a paper plane. Gradually, the plane descended slowly and touched the sand without crashing. It began sliding over the soft sand. The impact was not severe, but it was still a large metal body. However, it hit a large wooden platform on the beach used by fishermen for drying crabs. During the slide, the plane struck the platform with its right wing, which broke off. Losing balance, the left wing hit the ground on the other side and broke as well. Finally, the plane came to a stop without its wings. Despite the severe damage to the aircraft's body, the passenger cabin remained intact, and most of the passengers and crew were in good condition. Some fainted, but there were no serious injuries. Quickly, the passengers started getting up, opened the doors, and exited the aircraft in case of any explosion or fire. Most of the plane's fuel had run out, which was a blessing in such a situation because fuel usually ignites and causes explosions when planes crash. Fortunately, the plane did not explode, and nothing caught fire. The passengers were able to leave the aircraft without any fatalities. Some were injured, but there were no serious injuries, except for the captain's injury. The only death was the hijacker, whose body remained on board. The co-pilot was in a critical condition but also watched the passengers he finally managed to bring to safety, thinking to himself, "I've done my duty, completed my mission, and now I can rest." The co-pilot was later taken to the hospital but passed away there. Actual footage shows him being transported, but it is too graphic to display. Those who want to see it can search for the video title. As for the captain, he was also taken to the hospital, received treatment for the injury above his eye, and fully recovered. There is real footage of the plane wreck on the beach, which shows that it is almost completely destroyed. You can even see the hole caused by the first bomb. It is astonishing that all the passengers survived without any fatalities, almost a miracle. The only deaths were the hijacker and the co-pilot, Jan Munich Sai, who performed heroically in protecting the plane and saving the passengers. Remarkably, this was his first landing in a civilian aircraft, and it also became his last landing. The captain was honored with the country's highest civilian award, given a large funeral, and even promoted to the rank of pilot captain in recognition of his heroism. He was buried in the National Cemetery in Seoul, reserved only for soldiers or those who sacrificed their lives for the nation. This story is famous in South Korea, and I focused on providing the real details that actually happened. I even referenced Korean sources and translated them to ensure accuracy. Most of the footage in the video comes from a Korean film called Hijack, 1971, but the director added extra dramatic elements, especially at the end of the film. For instance, the fighter jets nearly shooting the plane and the co-pilot performing acrobatic maneuvers are exaggerated cinematic additions. These were not real events. The real events, according to Korean sources, were as follows. The hijacker detonated 2 bombs on the plane, one exploded the cockpit door, and the second exploded in the middle of the plane, causing a hole. The captain and co-pilot then tricked the hijacker into thinking they were in North Korea and attempted to land at an airport. The hijacker discovered the deception before landing. Fighter jets then arrived and warned that they would fire if the plane did not return. Ultimately, the security guard shot and killed the hijacker. The co-pilot shielded the bomb with his body. Finally, the plane made an emergency landing on the beach. All these events, though they sound incredible and unbelievable, are 100% true, confirmed by multiple sources. I always strive to bring you events that actually happened, though I sometimes add minor details like conversations to give context and atmosphere. The events themselves are real. As you can see, the story is insane and doesn't need any embellishment. The hijacker detonated 2 bombs on the plane, one destroying the cockpit door, and the second causing a hole in the aircraft. The captain and co-pilot tricked the hijacker, pretended they were in North Korea, tried to land, were intercepted by fighter jets, and ultimately the security guard neutralized the hijacker. The co-pilot sacrificed himself, and the plane was safely landed on the beach.